We shall not. And Russ, since you saved the computer over here, would you please lead us?
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, let me tell you what's going on up here with this spaghetti pot of wires and stuff. Thank goodness Russ came tonight. I have a regular slide presentation as part of the lecture, and then I have about a 2.5-minute presentation that I think would be fun, would undoubtedly violate the Johnson Amendment. I didn't get a chance to try it out on this computer. It's got some problems. So I've got it right now on my old laptop, and I've got to use my old laptop because that works with Alice's old projector. So at the end of this, I'm going to take a shot at playing it on this, if I can get the volume going. And with Russ here, I have great confidence that I will be able to do that. And if not, we're going to watch it on the glitchy old setup. Like I say, it's a little glitchy. The timing's off because there's a soundtrack to it. So it gets a little screwed up. But we'll appreciate it anyway, I think. So on the last class of We the People for now, because we may be on for a while, but that doesn't mean I'm dead. And I've had some feelers put out asking about a We the People class up in New Hampshire. So if that happens and we get things revived, maybe we can get things going back over here. Let me just say, for us, and all of you know this already, but this class has been ongoing for over 5 years. And it was founded, we all know, by Ed Welch. And 5 years is a good run. You know, because something comes to an end after 5, 6 years, it doesn't mean that it failed. This class was a success. There have been times when we've had 80 people in the room. There have been times when we've had 18 people in the room. And that's just the way it is. That's still more than many movie theaters, right? and still more than some classes that I've taught in my career. So we've done very well. And most importantly, we've learned a lot. And tonight, we're going to learn about the Johnson Amendment. Now, if you know what the Johnson Amendment is, raise your hand, please. Mike, you're cheating because you didn't know when you came in here.
Sure I did.
Oh, you liar. You.
I told you the people I invited had no idea what it was.
Oh, okay. All right. So about half the room doesn't know much about the Johnson Amendment. Is that fair? Right. It's actually very simple. And that's why I chose this topic for tonight, because number one, I want to be obnoxious in the last show here. And number two, it's really a pretty simple subject. Some people may try to complicate it, but it's pretty darn simple. And so we won't be here until 10 o'clock at night. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I need to say. Welcome to the people that are viewing this online. I hope you've enjoyed this class over the years. We've been broadcasting it for, I don't know, a year and a half, a couple of years. I hope you've enjoyed it and look for us to come back at some point. So the Johnson Amendment has to do with tax-exempt status for charitable organizations, for public service organizations. Not just public, but for even private serving organizations, which we'll cover in a minute. So tonight we're going to talk about, we're going to do a brief history of taxes on charitable organizations. And we're going to talk about the Johnson Amendment and what its purpose, what it is, and what its purpose is. And it's very clear what its purpose was. It's nefarious. And does the Johnson Amendment square with the Constitution? Because this is a Constitution class. Now, constitutional scholars on both sides of the aisle will tell you different things. There are some who say that it does not square with the Constitution, and there are others who tell you, oh yeah, it's perfectly fine, right? Well, I approach this as I approach all other topics that I've talked about, and any topic I'm interested in the Constitution, understanding that it was written for the average person. And if you can't understand it, it's been muddled for you because it's pretty straightforward, right? We're going to talk about enforcement and its impact on dialogue in this country and the challenges of and last to the Johnson Amendment. So let's see if I can work this right. Yes, I can. So here's a very brief history of tax exemption in the history of the world. Okay? And churches were exempt from taxes even way back in the Roman Empire. There's documentation of that. So tax-exempt organizations have been around for a lot longer than the United States of America. In fact, there's more documentation, the English Statute of Charitable Uses, and that is a precursor to our tax laws, at least to our Section 501 of our tax laws. And just like the English Constitution from the 17th century, the English Bill of Rights, our laws have their roots in English common law. Okay, and this is another example. Now, the English Statute of Charitable Uses was instituted to encourage charitable work, to encourage not-for-profit public service, right? And let's not forget, we always forget, our founding fathers, they were English at one time before they broke away. So this is what they were used to. They were used to English common law, and they were used to operating under the English Statute of Charitable Uses. Now, by the time the United States was about to erupt on the scene, already 9 of the 13 colonies, the British colonies, had some form of tax exemption for charitable institutions. And again, the purpose was to encourage charitable work because it was obvious that the government could not do everything that it would be nice to be able to do for the populace. Now, the legal structure in the U.S. tax code was developed. It's still developing, obviously, but majorly from 1894 to 1969. And it was in 1894. Henry, you looking for the Constitution class?
No.
But if you want to learn about the Constitution,
I'd love to talk about the Constitution.
So it was in 1894 that the first reference to tax exemption for churches and other charitable institutions was codified in the United States. Now, the brief legal history of tax exemption in the United States. So like I said, in 1894, it was the Tariff Act of 1894. There were no income taxes, remember. So this was exemption from tariffs and from property taxes. And it's the earliest statutory reference to tax exemption for a variety of institutions, including churches. The Revenue Act of 1913, we all know that one. Maybe we don't think about it by that name, but that's the one that established income taxes, right? And there, specifically named, were churches and certain other charitable organizations that were exempt from even income taxes. Next was the Revenue Act of 1917, and that was the Revenue Act that introduced the individual income tax. So they're coming closer together and getting more intrusive as we go along. But it introduced an individual deduction for charitable contributions. So for the first time, if you gave money to a church or to a charitable institution, you were able to deduct that from your gross income on your tax preparation. 1934 Revenue Act set limits on lobbying activity for charitable institutions. And what else? That's all we need to say about that. And here's the one that's of most interest here tonight. That's the Revenue Act of 1954. Now, this is what established the modern tax code that we work with today. And I'm going to show you, this is where the infamous or famous 501c3 or 501c4, C5 designations come for tax-exempt organizations. But here's the important thing. It also contained limits on political activities established by the Johnson Amendment to the Revenue Act of 1954. So the Johnson Amendment came into being in 1954. Here's a little bit of background of the Johnson Amendment. I don't know how that slide wound up looking like that, but Lyndon Johnson was completing his first term as a U.S. Senator from Texas. And he should win his seat handily in 1954, but he ran against some unexpectedly stiff opposition. And this opposition had the support of a couple of nonprofit organizations that were passing out leaflets and running ads and things like that. If you read some places, they tell you that they were secular, had ties to the church community. Right? I don't know what to believe because, you know, if in today's climate, it makes you understand, for me in particular as a scientist, it makes me understand, I'm going to use a bad word here, all that stuff we've heard was bullshit, okay? You don't know what to believe. So I'm not going to come down on one side or the other. But even the stuff that Marion and I used to look at and take for granted when in training or building our own science program, we now know doesn't mean it was questionable, doesn't mean it was wrong. I'm just saying that the credibility was down near zero for all of these sources, all right? So whether it was a secular organization or not, it doesn't make a difference. But LBJ, he didn't like that. And so he called on the Department of Justice or the Department of Revenue to investigate. And they did, and they came back and they said, it's perfectly legal. This group can run ads against you and talk about you and tell people not to vote for you. This had a lot to do with the McCarthy era, which I long for. And dare I say that? And the fight against communism. Because these groups and the voters and the candidates that opposed LBJ in this election, they believed he was far too soft on communism, and they supported the House committee. So that's the background of the Johnson Amendment. So what happened then is in 1954, when this large IRS package was being passed, Johnson tacked on the amendment. And it received almost no debate, received almost no notice. It just became stuck in the law and was passed in the 1954 Revenue Act. Now, let's look at what the Johnson Amendment says. So this part over here, can you see that little red thing there? All up to here is the original section. So here, this is paragraph 3, subsection C, section 501 of the IRS code, 501C3. Okay, that's where you get that from. And this was the original wording over here. The bold is the amendment itself. So let's read through it, and which does not participate in. So it's basically from year to year, it's saying you're tax exempt, except if you participate in or intervene, including publishing and distributing statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office.
Can you read the whole thing?
Yeah. All right. Corporations and any community chest, fund, or foundation organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. No substantial part, I think I cut out a little passage in here because it was going to get too long. No substantial part of the activities which is carrying out propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, except otherwise provided in section H. I have not read section H, so I can't tell you what's in there. So this is telling you what the tax-exempt organizations are, and which does or do not participate or intervene in the publishing, distributing statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. Okay, so here, for the first time, we're seeing limitations on speech associated with tax exemption. Let's point out some interesting facts about this. Tax exemptions for charitable organizations already existed in the United States and in other countries, and for a long time throughout history, as I've already mentioned. And it existed in section 501C3 of the new revenue code, right? So it was added there was no mention of political speech before Lyndon Baines Johnson's amendment. Whoops, I didn't want to do that yet. We've gone from an Apple to a PC, so the format's a little bit screwed up, but we'll survive that. So, therefore, there was no wording about political speech inserted into the IRS code at that time. So they were telling these organizations that they didn't have to pay taxes. They had certain exemptions. Not all of them were completely tax exempt, but they had certain exemptions. And the IRS wasn't telling them, if you don't talk about politics, we're going to reward you. Okay? What the IRS was saying, and what the effect, and indeed the stated purpose of the amendment, was to curtail political speech. These organizations already had tax exemptions. Now they're being told if you open your mouth the way we don't want you to, you may get punished. All right, that's exactly what I say in the third one. In other words, any organization or qualifying or individual qualifying for tax exemption, tax break of any sort, could be punished for political speech. Let's make no bones about this. That's what the Johnson Amendment is about. All right. Some people will say to you that it includes both secular and religious organizations, but we're going to address that in a minute. So the question that first arises is, does the IRS code violate the First Amendment of the Constitution? Now, this is the First Amendment over here, and Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Did anybody hear me say separation between church and state in there?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. I'm tired. I had a long drive today, so I just want to double check with you. So I've highlighted with bold print abridging the freedom of speech or the press, because these all apply, right? So on and so forth. There's the First Amendment. Does the Johnson Amendment violate the First? Does the Johnson Amendment violate the First Amendment to our Constitution?
Yes.
Sure. Look at me. I may be just a stupid, ignorant street urchin, but I can read. The answer is yes. Okay? But let's look at it a little bit more carefully, because aren't there some limits on free speech, right? That's the argument that's always thrown up in your face. Well, there are limits on free speech. Well, yes, there are. Let's go look at some of those. The case that established the idea is the iconic case establishing limits on free speech is Schenck versus the United States. Schenck was a war protester during World War I, and he was caught handing out leaflets and making speeches, and he was arrested, and he was convicted. He didn't get away with it. And the Chief Justice was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And it was from the Schenck case that this famous metaphor stating that you can't shout fire in a crowded movie theater arose. Okay? So it's the Schenck case. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes. Except that's not exactly what Oliver, yeah, question.
What was he convicted of? On what ground?
I don't remember if it was sedition
Some war
or
time.
what's that?
Probably
Yeah,
some more time, because that's
Yeah.
where all of this stuff came.
something like that. Yeah.
We had an enormous political prisoner population at the end of the Wilson administration, and most of it was in the excuse of the war.
Okay.
Yeah. So, looky here though. This wasn't Oliver Wendell Holmes' actual words. This is the phraseology that we see all the time. But his actual words were falsely shouting fire in a movie theater and causing panic. That's very important. He chose that wording very carefully because, you see, in other words, to be protected by the First Amendment, speech must be both false and dangerous. If it's false by itself, it can still be protected by the First Amendment, although there are issues about that. We can touch on a couple of them, where I'll bring it up briefly again in the next slide. And it can be dangerous as long as it's true. So to be unprotected by the First Amendment, speech has to be both false and dangerous.
And that's based on that case.
What's that?
And that's based on that case, the ruling in that
That's
case.
correct. That's
Not
correct.
necessarily based on the Constitution.
Right. That's what Oliver Wendell Holmes was saying. Yeah, question.
Fascinating as always. What would be dangerous speech that isn't false? But it is protected.
Well, let's go back to the movie theater example.
Fire.
If there really is a fire and somebody shouts fire,
Yeah, yeah.
that's. Or if Congress is trying to impeach your president, overturn an election for no reason.
Yeah.
You know,
You just yell.
well, that's both false and dangerous. So you can make accommodations up, I'm sure. Right. But we don't
Well,
want
they
to.
say that naming the quote-unquote whistleblower is dangerous,
Yeah,
but we're pretty sure we know who he is, so it would be true.
right. We can do this.
all night.
Yeah. So there are other categories of unprotected or less protected speech, for sure. Okay, and false speech sometimes can fall in that category. Of course, nowadays, there's almost nothing you can't get away with. You know, witness the Speaker of the House, Bella Pelosi, who's constantly making false statements publicly, not under oath most of the times. All right, obscenity, child pornography, fighting, and offensive words to provoke violence. This one's almost gotten taken away from us, right? Somebody gets in your face and you know says something really nasty to provoke you, or threatens you, and if you sock them in the jaw, well, guess who's going to be in more trouble, right? Unless you happen to be a member of that collegiate organization known as Antifa, then you can do what you want. Yes, question.
Well, at the same time,
Yeah, right.
a different set of terms have emerged as provocative.
Yes, offensive.
Yeah. So that's a moving trigger target. Look, you movable piece.
Right. Speech owned by others, in other words, it may be copyrighted, threatening the president, commercial speech, and that includes, I think, several different things, but I can imagine one instance where they're talking about if you, you know, been under a non-disclosure agreement with your company, for example. Immigrant speech, I put this one up here with a little asterisk because that's pretty interesting. Because you know why I put that asterisk there? Because the law for immigrant speech is not the same. You don't receive the same protections under the First Amendment. This is statutory under the First Amendment as an American citizen does. Just to let you know. What are the fine differences? I don't know. What does the statute say? I can't tell you, but I can tell you, get a load of this. There actually is a difference between someone who is not a citizen and someone who's a citizen of the United
In
States.
terms of constitutional protection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And nowadays, you know, talking about politics, right? If you, how does talking about politics fit in with that list? Does it really measure up? If a pastor or the chairman of a nonprofit organization says something in public about supporting a candidate, does that measure up to these egregious offenses over here? I don't think so. It's not even in the same class. So, no, talking about politics doesn't measure up to the point of losing First Amendment protections. Now, you know,
How does threatening the president fit into that?
I don't know the answer.
Because those are almost
Yeah.
all, and I understand that, but they're almost empty words. I mean, who in this room is a threat to the president? None of us has the capability of doing such a thing. And I'm not saying in every single case, obviously there have been a few attempts, but that is almost always all words.
Well, and I guess that goes back to the idea of threatening or provocative speech, like a black pen letter saying, if I send you a letter saying I'm going to kill you.
That's whole different.
It's different. Yeah.
So every month, the Secret Service is checking up on people. They you put something on Facebook, but it's got to be a threat, okay? Even to Trump, certainly under other presidents. But it can't be, you know, comes to mind that it would say, we should, I want to sue Trump or that, you get a call from them. Now, whether they
Yeah,
are
unless
going
you're
to, I don't know. We'll get a call.
And should. Have they heard Twitter? As far as, but truly, if we're talking about free speech, I mean, we're talking mostly about nutcases.
Yeah.
And people who are incapable.
I can only tell you that there's a certain vagueness to every single one of these, especially the Johnson Amendment, which we'll cover in a little
The
bit.
one that just popped in my mind, and of course, it's not the president. However, Madonna's saying, I'm gonna blow up the White House.
Yeah, oh, was that Madonna or that? Yeah. it's
Madonna.
Madonna, yeah.
I'm gonna blow up the White
Cut
House.
off his head.
And what
That's
happens? What happens? Nothing.
Yeah.
So we have,
Well, they
so,
Democrats.
and I'm not saying that necessarily that's wrong, I'm saying maybe the other part is wrong.
We don't know what the FBI is.
Yeah, we don't know what she did.
In her case, I don't know, I think it would be in the news, but in other
Yeah.
cases, the FBI does show up and give you an interview, and that is usually enough to shut people up a little. So, you know what? I gotta tell you, on the radio, in my daily personal transactions, I don't refer to them as Democrats very much anymore. They're communists.
Yeah.
Okay? They even say that they're socialists, but we know that socialism is just what communists call themselves in public. So I'm through with that. So you'll see me use the word communist here. And it's the same meaning as Democrats or the press or socialists, whatever. And it's a little provocative. Is that protected by the First Amendment, I wonder? So you all know what the communists say when you talk about the Johnson Amendment. The first thing out of their mouths is, and I've experienced this before a number of times on the campaign trail, they'll say, well, why should my tax dollars be paying for your political speech, right? Why should my tax dollars be paying, for you to be tax exempt? Well, here's the answer to that question. It's a very simple one. Number one is that nowhere in the Constitution does it say, under any circumstances, that your political speech is limited, right? You saw the First Amendment. You know what the First Amendment says. But more importantly over here is why should any of us receive tax exemptions and tax breaks, right? If we speak about politics, if we speak, we're all entitled to a variety of tax exemptions, like the ones listed here: personal tax exemption, exemptions for dependents, business deductions, medical and dental, retirement plans, work expenses, casualty and theft, and a whole host of other exemptions and deductions. I can make that same argument. Why should you be allowed to take a personal deduction if you're going to talk about politics? Why should my tax money go to support you if you're going to go out campaigning for a particular candidate? It's not a slippery slope. It's a cliff. It's a cliff. Okay? Now, why don't the communists ever ask about that cliff? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one is the very practical one, is that it affects them too, very much, right? And number two is that, like other criminals, just like with Second Amendment rights, they'll push the envelope, right? It's the law-abiding citizens who live under the hatchet. Yeah, so they don't want to lose their personal tax exemptions. So they're fine if the church is going to lose its tax exemption, right? Acorn, that's a different story altogether, right? We'll talk about some of those other tax exemptions. So does the IRS code violate the 14th Amendment? Equal protection under the law. And that's why I've highlighted this over here. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Does the Johnson Amendment protect people and institutions equally? This is really bizarre. I'm sure there's lots of examples, but I only pulled out a couple because they're particularly poignant. U.S. Code Section 115, income of states, municipalities, etc. Right? Government units, such as states and their political arms, are not generally subject to a federal income tax. Yet, governors, mayors, all sorts of state and municipal officers endorse candidates and campaign with and for candidates. So why is the government exempt if they can express speech freely, political speech freely? And the second one is labor unions. Labor unions receive all kinds of exemptions. Don't ask me to list them. But in theory, anything having nothing to do, well, certainly not in theory, with political activities, but all the things that unions do, voter registration drives, all that kind of stuff, they're entitled to tax exemptions for a large portion of their operating expenses. They were saying, and has anybody ever heard of a union endorsing a candidate? Not a Republican one, yeah, or going out and working for a candidate? Yeah. What?
No, in the old days, unions occasionally endorsed Republicans.
Oh,
They used to
that
come
was,
down and
yeah, they did.
favor,
Well,
The Teamsters were famously,
Yeah.
about half the time, or a little more half the time.
so in other words, here are two organizations, or several institutions that express their political views very freely, and yet they're entitled to tax exemptions. So that doesn't sound like equal protection under the law to me. I might be mistaken. So let's talk about how the Johnson Amendment has been enforced. The truth of the matter is, and this is interesting, is that it almost has not been enforced. All right? It almost has not been enforced. And I have a couple of examples that I'll talk to you about. So here's an example. In 2000, the DC Circuit Court affirmed the IRS withdrawing tax exemptions from this church over here, the Church of Pierce Creek, I think in Virginia, after it published full-page ads against, at that time, presidential candidate Bill Clinton. And the Supreme Court, well, no, it wasn't Supreme Court, it was district courts and courts of appeals upheld that withdrawal of tax exemption. Now, as far as I can find, and as far as what I read, in other words, scholars continually say, and legal analysts continually say, this is the only case that they can find where a tax exemption was ever withdrawn for violating the Johnson Amendment. Okay? In fact, the Alliance Defending Freedom has organized an activity they call Pulpit Freedom Sunday, and they actually, once a year, encourage pastors to get up at the pulpit, talk politics, endorse candidates, whatever they want, record it, pack it up, and send it to the IRS. All right? So, whoops, go back. According to the Washington Post, and according to the Alliance relying on the Washington Post, over 2,000 Christian clergy have done this, and only, I think, one. Let's see. Yeah, only one has actually even been audited. Right? So you might look at that, and again, the leftist view of this might be, well, they don't even enforce that. So what are you worried about? What are you making a stink about? Why do we have to repeal it if it's not even enforced? Right? So this is an article that I read a couple of days ago by Eric Stanley. It's published in 2012 on Regent University Law Review. And this was his conclusion at the end. The IRS's enforcement of the law, in his words, has been vague, arbitrary, sporadic, and even unequal at times. So we already talked about that. Here's the thing. Here's what the Johnson Amendment is all about. You don't need to enforce it because it's self-enforced, right? Just like anti-Second Amendment laws that would restrict the Second Amendment applicability and Second Amendment freedoms for law-abiding citizens. That's what the Johnson Amendment does. It's a threat, right? The implementers rely on vagueness. There's a whole section in this article about the vagueness of the law, and they keep piling vagueness upon vagueness, using language like, you may not do A, B, C, no, you may not perform the following activities, including A, B, C, D, E, F, but not restricted to those activities. But they don't, of course, you can't give an ad infinitum list of what's restricted. So vagueness is a tool of the Johnson Amendment. Okay? They can get you if they want to. Just like the IRS can get you on almost anything else if they want to. So again, the bottom line, the one word that describes the Johnson Amendment is, it is a threat. It's a threat. It's a hatchet hanging over your head. You know, and what it's saying is, if you dare say what we don't want you to say, we may or may decide not to punish you, but we may. So it's all about self-enforcement. Those of you who interact with your pastors or priests or rabbis, you know this very well. There are things that you can ask. In fact, I can only speak to the Catholic Church or I've seen in other religious establishments, but I can speak well for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church's biggest concern is fannies in the pews. Why is that their biggest concern? Because with every fanny, there's a hand, and in every hand, there's an envelope, and in every envelope, there's a check, and that goes into the basket on every weekend. Okay? The Catholic Church will actually go against its own doctrine to not offend anybody. Witness our communist pope, our Latin American communist pope. Okay? 4 or 5 years ago, my brother-in-law would have slammed me. In fact, he did slam me for saying things like that. I never called a pope communist in my life. But even he calls his pope communist, right? And my brother-in-law was given a lot of money to the church over many decades and is a devout Catholic. He said, no more. That's it. So pastors, priests, rabbis, they self-enforce. They won't do things that they're even perfectly allowed to do under the Johnson Amendment. Because of its vagueness, they still feel threatened. I'll give you a personal example. About 4 or 5 years ago, remember we put on a candidate's car wash? And I went to the Catholic Church. And because I was looking for a place that would have a parking lot, and just a spigot, shut me right down. Wouldn't do it. Well, we can't do anything political. I said, political? I said, we can make this bipartisan. I'll invite Democrats too. You know, it doesn't make a difference to me. It's a candidate's car wash. And I explained to him what the whole spirit of the thing was. Those of you who were there then, no, Catholic priest wouldn't do any, because he felt that he couldn't do anything politically, right? Let's just leave it at that. So, then the question remains, President Trump came into office and he said he was going to do away with the Johnson Amendment. So what has he done so far? Well, precious little so far, but that doesn't bother me. He's in office for less than 3 years, or just about 3 years now, right? No, less than 3 years. The Johnson Amendment is marked for death, okay? But on May 4th, the president, on the National Day of Prayer, signed an executive order, and here's what it says over here. It's mostly cover your back language and gobbledygook, but let's read through it, and I'll show you the parts I'm talking about. Respecting religious and political speech, all executive departments and agencies shall, to the greatest extent practicable and to the extent permitted by law. Right away there, that nullifies any real change, because the existing law is the Johnson Amendment, and that's tremendously vague. And really, from there, nothing else makes a difference. Respect and protect the freedom of persons and organizations to engage in religious and political speech. In particular, the Secretary of the Treasury shall ensure, to the extent permitted by law, that the Department of the Treasury does not take any adverse action against any individual house of worship. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. I'm just going to leave it at that. So it's to the extent permitted by law. So basically, he's telling the IRS, the agency, and other agencies, lay off religious speech, lay off the freedoms of religious speech that are covered by the Constitution. But it's really pretty meaningless at this point, this executive order. However, I have a great deal of confidence that in his second term, somewhere between years 4 and 8, you're going to see a renewed push, especially if the Republicans retake the House of Representatives, you're going to see a renewed push to actually repeal the Johnson Amendment. It violates our Constitution, and it hangs as a threat over our heads.
Now, there's a major exception to this, which is it's a standard part of Democratic outreach to go talk to black churches.
Bingo, that's right. And in fact, and I didn't even cover that, but particularly Southern Baptist churches are very active politically. They will have registration days where they will pack everybody up on the bus after they have a picnic, and they'll take them over to register. Now, I've never attended them, but I would wager with a great deal of confidence, parts of my body, that during the course of those days, the pastors talk about candidates and say which ones they like, which ones they don't like. But those churches are bold enough to do what they're allowed to do. But we find so many other Catholic and Christian churches and even synagogues that won't go anywhere near politics because in their mind it's fixed. If I talk about politics, this is what's going to happen. They can take away our tax exemption.
So I think there's just a terrible double standard there.
There is. Well, look at all of the organizations, there's double standard all over the place. Some are obscene. I don't know how many of you saw images. Now, you know that when you go into a polling place, if you go into a polling place and you're wearing even a flag these days, just an American flag, you will be asked to take that T-shirt off or turn it inside out. Right? How many of you have seen the pictures of the 2008 or 2012 election with poll workers sitting in a table in the polling place, information booth, with Obama's campaign logo? Have you seen the images of that? It's endless, right? It's endless. So yes, there's a double standard. We've got to take this country back from this. But here's the conclusions that you can draw. The Johnson Amendment was inserted into the IRS code to specifically punish certain kinds of speech. Okay, now then, it violates the First and 14th Amendment. Then, the problem was it was put there to punish people speaking against Lyndon Baines Johnson. But now, you know that it can be freely applied to almost anything. Basically, it exists as a threat to any political speech antithetical to the communist agenda, right? The commies can say anything they want, anywhere, anytime. In fact, they can almost do anything they want. They can burn buildings, right? Antifa can burn buildings. They can attack people, and it's like a turnstile. They're in and out. Meanwhile, some idiot slashes an inflatable balloon, and he's been arrested on some serious charges, right? Bastions of communism, like universities, are shielded. There's all kinds of political speech and political endorsements coming out of universities, not just from students or from faculty independently, but from institutional officers. I know this. I've seen it. I've been there, present. Enforcement is virtually always self-imposed. Your priests, pastors, and rabbis should understand this. The sorry part about this is that many of them do, but are too cowardly to follow their own word, to follow the word of the Bible.
Catholic pastors have bishops.
Yes.
I rather expect that the guy in South Carolina who was teaching like knew that his bishop was not going to come down and like come to this. Like maybe he would prove it, but he would be targeted and punished. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
there are other dioceses where obviously they would.
Yeah, I can think of two examples recently. There was just a synod, the Amazon thing. I don't know if you follow that.
I did.
Where these people, these bishops gathered, and their invited speakers included loud, steadfast, pro-abortion speakers. Now, it doesn't make a difference what side of that argument you or I are on. The church is supposed to be anti-abortion, right? So how do they invite this guy amongst them to speak to them? And there were other things at that thing. And there was recently a conference of bishops. No, it's just too much. I don't want to turn this into a Catholic bashing thing. I guess I'm allowed to because I'm Catholic. Though. That's it. Yeah. Thanks to President Trump, the Johnson Amendment has been marked for extinction. He said he was going to destroy it. But so far, at every opportunity that's been presented to him, and against tremendous resistance, he's kept virtually all of his promises that he's made on the campaign trail. This, of course, is viewed as a sin by the left. He actually kept it. All he wants to keep his promises, his campaign promises. That's all he's interested in. Well, you're damn right. That's why I voted for you. So, in the spirit, of what we discussed tonight, the Johnson Amendment This is a 501c3 organization. We people of Cape Cod, Inc. And I'm violating it right here. Probably. Actually, I could cover myself because it's so bathed in vagueness. What's that?
It doesn't say Trump, it says Make America Great.
That's right, it's a red baseball
Right.
cap.
Trigger
Right.
yes, you know how it goes.
Oh, yeah.
So look, that's the end of the Johnson Amendment. And truly here tonight, it is the end of the Johnson Amendment. We can take a minute for some questions and I'll try my best to answer them. But I have a little PowerPoint presentation that's got some video and a soundtrack to it. It's going to be very glitchy using my old laptop with that old projector. So I'm going to rely on Russ to see if we can get it up and running. So the soundtrack is timed to the slides. And as long as it's not screwed up, we'll have a fun little presentation. So we'll take a quick break after a question or two. And then I'll get together with Russ and see what we can do.
I'm a little confused with the 501(c)(3)s because I belong to one. We're not allowed to, we're a charity, and we haven't taken a nickel out of the dollar that's been donated so far. But we're not allowed to give to another charity. We can give to individuals, but we can't give to another, like, who called us? Make-A-Wish.
Yeah.
We could not give to them. And I'm listening to a lot of, Mary Lou was talking about the 501 that we are in for the Myra. And
So that's a 501c4, right?
okay, yeah, so that's, that's, okay, never mind. But it seems to me that a lot of the 501(c)(3)s are set up differently.
There's at least 5 or more 501 types of organizations that are covered by Section 501c of the tax of the IRS code. So, and I don't know them all now, but there are actually political organizations, there are educational organizations, charitable organizations, so on and so forth. And the rules are slightly different for each.
My question, because it concerns religious rights, is about the Equality Act, that it has passed the House, but hasn't made it to the Senate. That's the one. Where,
The Equality Act, which one is that?
that's about transgender athletes.
Yeah.
Women, in it.
Yeah,
you know,
it's
so
actually.
you would think it would protect women's sports, but instead it will destroy women's sports, and it will remove an opportunity for religious organizations.
Or a new law?
That's what?
Is it a case or?
No, it's a law that's been passed in the House.
Okay, well, that might be actually what's on the Supreme Court docket for this fall. There are several cases dealing with transgenderism that have been grouped together.
This is actually passed in the House, and of course it's called
passed in the Senate.
equality. It's called equality.
Yeah, right.
So you know how they do that. They make it sound like it's about equality.
The equality
It's about-
and kumbaya.
And it's like no equality.
Right.
And it would destroy religious organizations' opportunity to object to those topics.
I'm gonna make a guess that you're thinking that it's been passed into law, but it's just passed the House.
Just pass the House.
Yeah, because that's not, so
Has not passed.
it's utterly irrelevant. It's like,
utterly
what you hear in
irrelevant.
the fake news all the time is that the House passed this and the House passed that, and everybody gets all,
Right.
their panties all twisted up.
Right.
But it's meaningless because it's
Because it
never
hasn't
even gonna
passed the
come
Senate.
before.
Yeah.
The full Senate, it's gonna be.
Right. It probably won't even be brought up, but it's it's part of an agenda.
Yeah. Ed, did you have something to say?
No, although 501c4, when you go into this stuff, the ideas, there are borderline, like key parties were sometimes organized 501c3. That meant they didn't throw out candidates, which they weren't necessarily doing anyway. They wanted to talk about issues. Like if you're in party politics, that's what the 501c4 is about.
Some organizations do both. The League of Women Voters is both a 501c3 and a 501c4. And they divide, when they're lobbying, they use their 501c4 status, and then when they're doing educational work, like getting alcohol, stuff like that.
All this stuff needs to just be simplified. We need to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, and I expect it'll happen. Because what's going to happen is it will be challenged, particularly when Darth Vader Ginsburg kicks the bucket and is no longer on the Supreme Court. And by the way, I don't know how many of you noticed, but she wasn't present
Yeah,
for oral
I did notice.
arguments yesterday. I don't know if she was present today.
I don't know either.
My prediction is I'm betting 50-50 that she's not going to make it through this fall term of the Supreme Court. It's not easy for someone with stage 4 cancer to last that long. So, oh no, she doesn't have stage 4 cancer. She has a cold. Well,
She has what?
a cold.
That's what they said.
A cold.
Remember before Gorbachev came on board, it was Yuri Andropov and the one who succeeded him in the Soviet Union. There were 2 premiers that both came and went in just a matter of weeks. They got into office and then they were served for a few weeks and then they caught a cold. And they were out of the public eye for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then all of a sudden they weren't anymore. And that's Darth Vader Ginsburg is in that circumstance right now. When she goes, the Supreme Court will be 5-3 and then 6-3. And Justice Breyer, using the word justice in the same sentence with his name is tough for me. Justice Breyer is in his 80s. He's not going to be much longer for the world either. I think like a 98-year-old couple, when Ginsburg goes, Breyer will probably go soon after. And at that point, there are going to be several major cases coming before the Supreme Court with greater surety that they're going to pass.
But we'd have to wait for the election to appoint because it's within a.
Well, I don't know.
an
First of
election
all,
year.
Ginsburg, if Ginsburg has to leave the Supreme Court,
Right.
they're going to put somebody on board right away. So it doesn't have to wait for the election. If she survives till beyond the election, then yeah, we've got to wait until the next 4 years. But she's not going to make it another 4 years. I'd be very surprised if she makes it.
No, what I meant was because of the Merrick Garland and not appointing.
No, first of all, there's a substantive difference between the Merrick Garland nomination and what's happening right now.
Okay.
Right? The first thing is that Obama was term limited. So there was going to be a new president that year. That's number one. He was a lame duck.
Okay.
Donald Trump is not a lame duck. Okay.
Okay.
Now, on top of all that, the big difference is, the real big difference, is that Republicans have finally decided to play hardball instead of getting stepped on. And if Darth Vader Ginsburg drops dead 48 hours before Donald Trump is even voted out of office, they're going to cram it through as fast as they can. So I feel good about that. You know?
See, there was a bit of a risk. Obama picked Garland because Garland was not a bomb thrower. That really just determined how he was going to vote. He would have voted the rest of the fairly uniform, but he was not considered a rat. If Hillary had won, then the Senate would have been faced with the fact that it would either have had to quickly confirm Garland, get him in quickly, or wait until Hillary was inaugurated and with the risk that she would post Garland and something do more radically. So there was a calculated gamble on McConnell's part. So he played his poker hand pretty well in that particular case.
Yep, it's good to see finally. All right.
Well, it makes you wonder whether he, unlike almost everybody, thought Trump had a chance, but didn't say anything.
Well,
You know?
lots of people thought and understood that Trump not only had a chance, but was the odds-on favorite to him. It's just that wasn't the narrative that the fake news put forth. But just like in 2020, the models that actually are effective models, like the Moody's model, or what's his name? I'm blocking on the guy's name right now. He said either George Mason University or whatever, one of the ones that.
Rasmussen?
What?
Rasmussen?
No. This guy is on the faculty at one of the Washington area universities. His model has been back tested to Lincoln's day. And the Moody's model has been back tested till at least, I think 1988 or 1970, I don't remember, a few decades.
Mhm.
And they're both saying exactly what they said in 2015. And that is that a Republican was going to win the White House. And this doesn't have anything to do with a specific candidate, although a specific candidate, their qualities or lack thereof could affect the outcome. But these things are based on the party in power and the party out of power. And there's a list of factors that, if X number of them are working out for the party that's in power, they're going to get reelected, that party. There's virtually nothing to do. In fact, the guy who devised this model says it has absolutely nothing to do with the candidate. That's not quite true, I don't think. But it largely just has to do with partisan politics. So if you're finishing your first term in the presidency and the economy is doing good, there are no disasters overseas, there's not a lot of domestic violence, and several factors like that, you're going to be reelected. Right? That's why incumbents get reelected. Things have to be pretty bad, or it has to be a special case for an incumbent to not be reelected. And Donald Trump, I'm not going to predict the future, but we need to make sure that it happens. Did I just violate the Johnson Amendment again? What's the matter with me? Did that get broadcast across the world? Did they pick that up in Germany and Australia too?
Yep, they're
I'm
blowing up.
worried about a panic.
Yeah.
In September or October.
Well, that's what their aim is, but so far he's been a step
I don't
ahead of
think they can create a recession, but if there's one that is coming, I'm sure they can tweak the data.
Yeah, but there's not going to be a recession in 2020. My recollection, and I think I've read further back, in a year where the Fed has cut rates 3 times or more, the following year there has never been a recession. Stock market's going to do well. Companies are going to be moving in 20. The economy is actually going to be better in 2020 than it is in 2019. So
Those trade agreements are one indication of.
when they come through,
yeah.
And Nancy Bella Pelosi is about to crack on the North American trade agreement.
Yeah.
She just announced today that they want to get that done before the end of the year. That tells you that things in the impeachment inquiry aren't going well. If she's looking to toss out that chip. All right, give us just a couple of minutes to try to set this up and see if it works. If it's glitchy, if the timing isn't quite right, I'm going to play it anyway. You'll be able to use your imagination.
I think it might already work.
Yeah, it might. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to put this little